We're going to take a look at the topic of process strategy. Processes exist in all organizations, and the fundamental role of a process is essentially to create a product or a service. There are sub-processes, and you have sometimes a service or a product is created from several processes that are linked together. Now, we could treat a process as a passive entity, something that just simply creates a product or a service. However, processes have the capability or the opportunity to create competitive advantage. And so therefore, we have to now take a strategic look at processes. So what is process strategy or process strategies? Essentially, the objective of process strategy is to really create that product or service that meet or exceeds the customer's requirements, but subject typically to a set of managerial constraints. So we may have constraints on cost, we may have constraints on the use of resources, we may have constraints on time, energy, etc. So all of those constraints sort of limit the kinds of choices that you may actually have in terms of what processes you can use. In sort of classic production systems, we often talk about three broad categories of processes. And those three broad categories of processes came about as a result of a need to trade off between two very important variables. One is the volume of product that you could produce, and the other one is the variety or flexibility of that process to produce a number of different types of products. And we often would see those two as a trade-off. In other words, if you want high volumes, then you have to expect low variety. If you want high variety, you have to expect low volumes. So if we examine the trade-offs between those two variables, we get the following types of processes. At the upper corner, where we have low volume, high variety, we typically would have what we call process focus types of organizations. So a hospital, for example, in one area you could have radiology, in another area you could have general surgery, intensive care, MRI units, and so on. So different parts of the hospital will focus on different processes. And so the hospital is configured around those different types of processes. In some cases, we have assembly lines that a number of process steps keep getting repeated, while the product may have some variation to it, not a whole lot, but the sort of core of the process is repetitive in nature. And so the making of appliances, motorcycles, automobiles, and different types of electronics and so on tend to go through that. So you have an assembly line forming a very major part of that process. And along the assembly line, you'll have different workstations. But the product flow tends to happen from the beginning to the end of that process. And then we have what we call a product focus. That is, the organization is designed around a product, and depending on what that particular product needs, and it typically does not change. So commercial baked goods, for example, or the making of steel or paper or beer, the brewery does not change its structure. The flow from the hops down to the bottles being filled, that process is exactly the same and is designed based on how that product is generated, and it does not change. There's very little variety. You may change the menu a little bit, light beer versus dark beer, and so on, but really the process is pretty much the same at this stage. What if we wanted now variety and volume? Well, this is where, so in other words, we want to push the trade-off curve this way. In this case, then, we're looking for some kind of technology that allows for high volumes and high flexibility at the same time. We call that mass customization. And Dell was one of the major pioneers of mass customization. The idea is simply this: if you produce a product or create a product that is modular in design and that each module could have a couple of different options to it, but you just assemble a product by simply putting those modules together. Then you get the benefit or the semblance of having flexibility while you could still assemble that product and produce very large volumes. So that's what mass customization is really all about. If you think of a computer, you could have a couple different hard drives, a couple different speeds, whether or not the screen is matted or glossy and that sort of stuff like that. So you have a couple of options available to you for different component parts, and then just the sort of mixing and matching of those create the semblance of different products. So process strategies, as we mentioned, is really about producing a product or service that meets the expectations of customers, but at the same time must meet some managerial constraints. And it has long-term effects on efficiency, flexibility, cost, and quality. So just think the quality capabilities or the cost capabilities of a process focus versus a repetitive focus are two different things. You have very large capital costs involved in a product focus compared to, if you compare that to, a process focus, where you have high variable costs but not as large fixed costs as a product focus type of operation. Okay. So we mentioned already that the four basic strategies are process, repetitive, product, and mass customization. In a process focus, I've already mentioned that essentially the facilities are organized around activities or processes, such as a hospital. And it looks like this. So if you look here, you can see that you have many different areas. Lots of parts come in, and then depending on where the emphasis needs to be, the entity is routed. For example, in the case of a hospital, if you go into surgery, if you go into radiology, if you go in just for clinical checkups and so forth, you go to the different parts of that organization. All right. Repetitive focus, assigned usually in the form of assembly lines. There are modules of parts that are assembled, and that process tends to be fairly repeated. Harley-Davidson, again, you have all the parts come in together. You have fairly few options in terms of the variety, and then you produce the parts from the combined modules. And then the product focus, the facility is actually organized around the product. It has high volumes but low variety, and typically the production is continuous, whereas in assembly lines, production tends to be more discrete, or in terms of a process focus as well. And making of chips, you add a few inputs in there, and then you produce some variations on the sizing and the packaging and the labeling. But pretty much the process is fixed, as I mentioned to you. This is a steel plant. As you can see, very expensive capital equipment. Mass customization. You have it's rapid, low-cost production of goods and services, and essentially it combines flexibility and volume to produce that. Okay, we can see what has happened in the last several decades. That in terms of getting the number of choices of variety, that with mass customization now we can do quite a bit. If you think about even the book industry, where publishers are saying to professors, and I'm talking about the textbook industry, that we could customize our books for our students. So the very same textbook is available, but now all we need to do is to specify which chapters we want, and the binding technology is such that it can bind any combination of chapters for us in any order fairly quickly, and technology certainly has enabled that to happen. All right? So I will just look at a quick comparison of the different types of processes. We see in terms of a process focus, we have small quantity, large variety of products, repetitive, long runs, typically a standardized products with a few options, and a large quantity, small variety is produced here. but then we have a combination of both large quantity and large variety. In terms of the equipment, general purpose equipment. In terms of repetitive, special purpose equipment. And then here is highly special purpose. But in this case here, you have equipment that allows you to have rapid changeovers, because if you did not have rapid changeovers, it would be very difficult to have flexibility at the same time. The operators are broadly skilled, employees are modestly skilled, and operators are even less skilled. Okay? Flexible operators that are trained just for the need of customization in this case. Job instructions, there are many job instructions here. Repetitive operations tend to reduce the amount of training necessary. And then work orders and instructions are very few because they're highly standardized in the case of a product focus. And custom orders require many job instructions as well. Okay. In terms of raw materials, you have raw materials of relatively high value to the value of the product. We tend to use just-in-time procurement techniques with repetitive focus. Raw material inventories tend to be very low relative to the value of the product because you produce in such large volumes. And raw material inventories are low relative to the value of the product in mass customization as well. We tend to have large amounts of work in process inventory in process environments, and of course as we go through here, we tend to drive that down. GIT helps to reduce the level of inventory as we go through these other types of systems. Okay. Now, in very few cases, you may find that the types of processes are totally substitutable. But there are cases where it's possible to use a craft-based approach, which might be much more process-oriented, versus an assembly line approach, where you do some standardization with a small amount of variation in terms of product types. There may even be the possibility of considering mass customization as well. So how can we decide using costs as a decision variable? And what we essentially need to do is to do what we call these crossover charts, where we plot the fixed costs and the variable costs. And depending on the volume of production that's needed, one particular process technology might be favored over the next. So if you look at these graphs right here, for example, so in this case of the green line has the largest fixed cost but the lowest variable cost. This light blue line here, or that's turquoise I guess, has the sort of intermediate, the next lowest fixed cost but slightly higher variable cost, and so on. So at this point, when you look at this, you see for different volumes the crossover points V1 and V2, that at this point, this line represents the cheapest, which basically means that you would use process A. Between here and here, the lowest cost line is the turquoise line, which means you would use process B. And then as you continue over here, you use the green line, which is process C. So this is just a sort of an idea as to how you could use cost information, break-even points, and so on, to tell you where, at what point you switch over from one to the next. All right. Once processes have already been established and they're in use, it's very difficult to actually change them. Meaning you start over your production facility completely, typically expensive, and so when you're starting a new organization, that's why the process decision is a strategic one, because it has long-term implications. So from the beginning, it's very important to get that decision optimized, because you cannot just change your processes on a monthly basis, on an annual basis. The process choice that you make, you'll be stuck with it for a couple of years. And so it's important to take that into consideration. One of the things we have to do when we are looking at process choices is to do some analysis on the capacity and capability of a process. So we could ask questions such as, is the process designed to achieve a competitive advantage? Does it eliminate steps that are unnecessary, that do not add value? Does the process maximize value to the customer? And will it actually help you win orders? And that depends. If you want to use the process as a vehicle for competitive advantage. So there are a number of tools that we can use to really assist us in doing process analysis, flow charts, time function mapping. Um, and so with flow charts, you could actually examine the various steps or stages in the process, and then when you analyze that, you could find opportunities for reducing wait times and so on. So if you look at this particular example, this process takes 52 days. There's a fair amount of, from ordering the lead time, there's a fair amount of lead time here. There's a fair amount of wait time, 13 days. There's 1 day of WIP. There's 4 days wait here, 1 day you're moving, and then another 10 days to wait. So that's 15 days that's been wasted right here. And then you have extrusion 1 day and so on. So surely this process can be redesigned to try to get much better performance. Down to 6 days, if you look at this now, you could see how you've cut down the order lead times to 1 day, the wait time and print to 2 days. And then over here, you've removed all those steps that move and everything. In between here, you have some work in process inventory, but it's only 1 day's worth of that. And then you do the extrusion. You could actually go from 52 days to 6 days. That is a major achievement. So by using these tools, we could often take a look at redesigning our products. Right? So there are other tools as well. Value stream mapping allows you to look at the flows and ask what value is being created at each point. Process charts basically use symbols to tell you what kind of activities are taking place at each stage. And then service blueprinting is a tool that's used for you to map the flow of a service, but for you to also be cognizant of the customer interaction in that service as well. I'm not going to spend too much time on these tools. You could certainly review them for yourself. But as you could see here with the value stream map, we show from suppliers all the way down to customers and what's happening at each stage. You have a lot of the non-value added time is actually in those spots right here. 6 days wait, 4 days wait. So a lot of either transportation or waiting that happens here. But the values are actually created when the part or the product is being processed. Okay? So value stream mapping will allow you to look for opportunities to change or to reduce the non-value added time. Okay. Process charts again just allow you to map and show the different types of activities, and you see here the symbols will tell us exactly what's happening. Operation, transportation, inspection, a delay, and storage. So if you look across here, we could look to see how many stages of this process involves a delay, in which case we could try to find ways to reduce those delays if we're trying to improve the process. Service blueprinting, as we said, it focuses on customer interaction. And here's an example of a service blueprint of a customer coming into, I believe it's a hotel for service. So let's see what we get. Oh, no, that's actually a customer taking a car to a garage. So you see here at one level, we're looking at the customer arriving. At another level, the interaction of the customer with the organization. And at the level here, this is just the organization performing the work. Okay? And then the customer departs. So we are mapping this flow. And at each stage of this, we could always ask, how can we make it more efficient? How can we reduce bottlenecks? How can we reduce non-value added time? How can we reduce costs? How can we reduce the chances of errors being performed and so forth? So this diagram is actually quite useful in that regard. In terms of considerations for service process design, while a lot of the analysis that was done a few decades ago focused largely on manufacturing, the need to improve efficiency in service organizations does actually make you pay attention to service processes. So, a couple of things that we could consider. Some interaction with the customer is often necessary. However, in some cases, it could actually affect the performance adversely. So you may want to ask questions like, is it possible to automate a particular step? Can we move that step out of that process and have it performed by somebody else? The better these interactions are accommodated in the process design, the more efficient and effective the process will be, and find the right combination of cost and customer interaction so that you could add value to customers. All right. Now, in much the same way that we've sort of described or defined manufacturing processes, we often want to be able to do the same for service processes. While we looked at a sort of a volume variety trade-off, in this case, it's a little different when you talk about volume of services. So rather than use volume, what was suggested by Robert Schirmer was two variables which included the degree of customization of the product, which is kind of equivalent to variety, and then the degree of labor input relative to capital. So this is high labor input to capital, low labor input to capital, which means that essentially capital is much higher in this section. So if we look at this, he was able to classify a number of service organizations. So here, if we have a low degree of labor to capital, so that means you have a lot more equipment, and capital costs tied up with that, and low degree of customization, very little customization, we could call this a service factory. And service factory, fast food restaurants, limited service stockbrokers, warehouses, no-frill airlines, they don't customize anything for you. So we would call that a service factory. And here, if we have a higher degree of labor to capital, but still very little customization, you refer to that as a mass service. So that's the terminology that was proposed. Commercial banking, retailing, boutiques. So in a case like that, people are quite involved, but there's not a lot of customization. So you go to Sears, you're not going to find too much customization for you. Okay. Now we come down to here, where we have low degree of labor to capital, which means that fair amount of capital equipment in here, but there's a fair amount of customization. So in a case like that, you could get into looking at hospitals, specialized hospitals, fine dining restaurants where the chef actually will make the food exactly to your taste, so there's customization. But then the degree of labor to capital, so there's a lot of high capital equipment, particularly in things like hospitals. Fine dining restaurants may have a fair amount of capital equipment in the kitchen as well too. And then we go to this area which we call a professional service. Actually, if I go back just for a second, we refer to this group here as a service shop, and then here professional service. High customization, high labor input. So we get into private banking, general purpose law firms, digital orthodontics, traditional orthodontics. So here there's customization that happens, and then the labor input is quite high. So you think about going to your orthodontist, spend quite a bit of time. There's some technology that is being used, but then spend quite a bit of time getting your braces fitted for your needs. Okay, and these different types of services, or the classification scheme that is used here, have implications. So mass service and professional service, if we remember what mass service and professional service is, the labor input is very high, and so therefore selection and training of labor becomes important. You have to focus on human resources, and then of course you want to focus on personalized services. In terms of service factory and a service shop now, in this case labor input is very low, and you could do a lot more standardization using automation and so forth, because you're using a lot less labor. Okay, but then you have to have some tight control over your standards to ensure that the equipment could actually deliver in a consistent manner. So things like maintenance then become quite important. How can we improve productivity in services? Well, we certainly can do that. A couple of things actually will allow us to do this. If we could actually separation is one strategy. Can we separate parts of the services and have them perhaps even done in parallel or made offline, put offline? So structured services that customers must go where the service is actually offered. Bank customers go to the manager to open a new account, to loan officers for loans, and to tellers for deposits. So you could do some separation, kind of like a division of labor concept. Self-service, so you could actually have the customer as a temporary employee and you serve yourself, you get some speed and efficiency. So if you were to go to the cafeteria and you self-serve, then you're talking about customers actually participating in that process. Supermarket self-service, now there's self-checkouts, you're starting to see that. Placing internet orders, checking in online for your flights, all those are examples of self-service. Postponement, customizing at the delivery point. So rather than having a bunch of inventory that is sort of pre-designed, you could actually customize when you deliver it to your customer. So you improve efficiency in that fashion. Focus, restricting the offerings, like McDonald's offering limited menus. And modules, if you could actually develop your service in terms of some modular aspects of that. So for example, prepackaged foods certainly helps. If you think about some restaurants, one of the things that they do, or let's just think about Subway. When you go to Subway to purchase a sandwich, if you're asking for cheese, the cheese is actually already prepackaged into a quantity. If you're asking for meats like ham and so on, then that's actually already pre-measured, pre-ordered, and they simply take that amount and put it in the sandwich. So by doing that, you actually help to improve efficiency of the process as well. Automation certainly helps. Some scheduling is very important. If you have a walk-in clinic, you will tend to find that you have periods where you have very high levels of utilization. The physician is quite busy, but then there are periods where perhaps the physician is idle because no one is there. You're waiting for people to arrive. However, if you schedule, you could actually level. You could level your demand across a time period. Every 15 minutes you would see a patient, in which case you now balance the productivity or the utilization of the resources. And of course, training gives people better skills allow them to perform a whole lot better. Okay? Excuse me. Some other things that we could do is look at the layout of the facility to ensure that the layout facilitates efficiency. Of course, in human resources, we often focus on recruitment and training and making sure that the employees have some flexibility in terms of the ability to perform different services. In other words, they are cross-functionally trained. Equipment and technology in processes. Sometimes we have some choices, and the type of equipment and technology that we use could enable or help to create capacity or help to create flexibility or could help to stabilize processes. So it's useful to kind of be aware of some of the types of technologies that can be used. In manufacturing, we often talk about group technology, computer-aided design, computer-aided manufacturing, and so on. In services, we're starting to see quite a bit of use of technology in services. In the financial services, we see the use of debit cards, electronic funds transfer, ATMs, internet, stock trading, online banking, on your cell phones, all these apps that we have available to us nowadays. In education, electronic bulletin boards, online journals, WebCT, Blackboard, smartphones, and so forth. Restaurants, wireless orders from the waiters to the kitchen, robot butchering, transponders on cars that track sales at drive-thrus, etc. So we do have quite a bit of use of technology in hotels, electronic check-in, airlines as well, ticketless travel, healthcare, online patient monitoring, medical information systems that have patient records. It's just a whole host of technology has really revolutionized how we deliver products and services. The last thing I'm going to talk about briefly is about the concept of process redesign. What happens is that we sometimes design a process at a given point in time, And over time, things have become a lot more competitive. The environment has become more competitive. Customers expect a whole lot more, and the process that we design cannot deliver what we're looking for. So we often have to consider redesigning that process. So process redesign was very popular in the 90s. Michael Hammer and Champy were the two folks who wrote a seminal article in Harvard Business Review about redesigning business processes. The fundamental rethinking of business processes to bring about dramatic improvements in performance relies on reevaluating the purpose of the process and questioning to what extent the purpose is still relevant, or what are the underlying assumptions, and are those assumptions still relevant? And if they're not, then the process perhaps is designed is no longer relevant or appropriate or efficient or effective. So we would have to consider that. And so it requires re-examination of the basic process and its objectives. Then it needs to look at activities that go across functional lines and try to redesign for the purpose of improving performance. And we also want to mention that processes impact sustainability, where nowadays we are quite concerned about the impact of operations on the environment. The process choice you make will actually impact your ability or the effect that your organization has on the environment. And so some processes have less of a carbon footprint. Some processes certainly have more. They use more energy, they require more people, labor, they might be less safe, and all of those things we have to consider. Anyway, in considering your processes, you would always look at your resources, whether or not there are some recycling options, the 3 R's: reuse, reduce, or recycle. And then, of course, what the regulations are that have implications for your process choice, and what kind of reputation that you want to create for your own organization, and to what extent the process will actually help to create that. So I think we've given you a sense of the importance of process and process strategy, recognizing that process brings capabilities to an organization, and those capabilities ought to support the competitive strategy or the mission and vision of that organization. We do have in manufacturing a number of process choices. In services, certainly we have process choices as well. And technology plays a crucial role in both manufacturing processes and service processes. And ultimately, we must always be cognizant of the impact the process choice that you make has on the environment. Recognize that if you're starting anew, that your process choice is a strategic one because it has to be a long-term decision. However, if the process is already in existence, one could still reconsider whether or not the current process is appropriate, or whether or not there should be an emphasis on redesigning that process and improving it. So hopefully that has given you a sense of the importance of process in operations and process in enabling strategy.